La parole, vous aurez déjà oublié de qui il s'agit. Je vais juste me contenter de vous dire que nous avons ce matin des intervenants qui viennent des États-Unis, de Bahreïn, de Chine, de Turquie, de Russie, de Croatie. Voilà, j'espère n'avoir oublié aucune origine. Donc voilà, on va pouvoir brosser très largement le tableau. Évidemment, je vais m'excuser auprès de Madame Biden et de Madame Rajab immédiatement. Elles vont avoir la parole très tôt. J'aurais pu leur donner la parole en premier, mais nous allons commencer avec Robert Kaplan. Vous avez peut-être vu intervenir hier dans un autre panel que je modérais. Robert Kaplan s'excuse puisqu'il va prendre un avion, donc il va intervenir en premier et ça va nous permettre de commencer par une présentation assez générale, en accent peut-être, puisque Robert Kaplan est Managing Director de l'Eurasio Group, de commencer par peut-être ce qui peut faire figure de principal danger pour la stabilité mondiale. C'est la menace de guerre commerciale entre les deux principales puissances du monde aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire puissance à la fois économique bien sûr, mais aussi militaire, les États-Unis et la Chine. Robert, can you tell us where we are in this dispute between US and China?
China needs the South China Sea to solidify its emerging influence in the Indian Ocean, where it is building a commercial empire of sorts. The US Navy is not budging an inch, and China needs the South China Sea to further soften up Taiwan. And again, the US Navy is not budging an inch. Then there's ideology, the ideological split between the two sides. For almost 4 decades, China was, in relative terms, a benign, enlightened, collegial, risk-averse, authoritarian system that the Congress, the business community, and the media in Washington and New York could tolerate. But the Chinese system has evolved to be a more hardline authoritarian system, and as a result, China has no friends left in Congress or the media in the United States. And then there is cyber, where the US and China are already in a cyber conflict. The Chinese have successfully hacked into the Pentagon's personnel system, into the US Navy ship maintenance logs, into US military contractors around the US, and US Cyber Command at the Pentagon now theoretically has the permission to launch retaliatory strikes into China. So cyber is dividing up the two sides, and this is to say nothing of the race for which 5G network countries around the world accept, the US or China, or the case against Huawei. So just to sum up, it's a shame to say, but the world system is going to be compromised by the fact that US-China relations are really evolving into a bipolar conflict. And just finally, I'll say one positive thing, that neither side sees it in its interest at all to ever have a hot war or a hot conflict.
Thank you, Robert. Maybe we should stay on this topic, US-China dispute. I think it would be interesting to, at this stage, to listen to our friends from China. Maybe Andrew Young, do you want to take the floor and tell us if you agree with this presentation that Robert just made?
Well, so you combine all that. I entirely agree that any kind of deal, if at all, is unlikely to resolve the issue. And I do believe that this kind of generational conflict between a sitting superpower and a perceived rising challenger, even though it doesn't necessarily result or spring the so-called Thucydides trap, is going to cause a lot of turmoil all around.
Thank you. Excuse me, I just missed the presentation because I forgot to say that your international China strategy and independent, that's important, the word independent strategist. We have Mr. Wang, Yong Wang, you're director of the Beijing University Center for International Political Economy Research. Can you give us your take on this, the same subject?
I think that is the economic globalization per se is not the source of the domestic issues, especially the widening wealth gap between the rich and poor. But such the issues has caused the political tensions in the countries like in all the countries, especially in the United States and in Western countries. China is also no exceptions. But because of the differences of political institutions, we have seen the different the policies to cope with the transformations and the consequence of economic globalizations. For example, in China, China also have the challenges created by the globalizations. But China, because there is no pressures of the election, the Chinese leader and the Chinese government can concentrate on the restructuring of domestic economy, to have a better job in the addressing all these challenging issues. In the anti-corruption campaign, tough measures on the environmental protections, as well as the efforts of reducing the poverty. In international realm, we have seen China has adopted the proactive approach to the global governance, to international economic operations, which has been reflected. China's recent the year's initiative, such as the Belt Road Initiative, a more the constructive role, a larger role in the global governance. China working for the concept like the shared destiny of mankind, in strengthening the multilateral the institutions. On the other hand, we have seen that is the challenges. That is the negative responses in the Western countries, including the United States. Right. So I think now we have a very different era. We have diffusions of power. So we have in the watershed period for the mankind. So we have I think all the major powers, especially the United States, should recognize their the great responsibility in ensuring the security, peace, and prosperity of mankind. So they have to work together, right? So not engaged in so-called the traditional strategic rivalry. I personally, I think we might have some good news about the U.S.-China trade negotiations. We are very close to making a deal. Even that is not right, to resolve all the issues, but that will be helpful to improve the situation of the relationship. But we will have to make more efforts to build political trust between the U.S.-China and the regional corporations. I think that is U.S.-China, especially the Trump administration policy on China, the trade war, has give space and opportunities for the regional economies in Asia Pacific to work together on the regional, region-wide integrations. So I think that might be some helpful and to the balance the changes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wong. Mr. Wang Lukon, on your right, you asked for the floor. I give it to you. You're a senior fellow of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You're coming from the United States. Do you share this optimism?
I'd like to.
Can you push the button? Yeah.
I'd like to provide a bit of a context. Why is it that China's tensions with the West are peaking just right now? If you look at the whole world globally, we've been debating for about 15 years whether China's rise is a threat or opportunity. And from an American perspective, it's largely seen as a threat. Europe feels more or less the same way, but with less intensity, because there's less of a great power complex in terms of dealing with Europe. The rest of the world, including Africa, the views are more mixed. They're more positive. Countries see benefits from China's trade investment increases, but there are also concerns. So this question of threat or opportunity varies depending upon the region. There is a question then of what kind of a great power is China? And one of the difficulties that the West has in dealing with China is what I would call China is not a normal great power. I've written a book about China. I call it an abnormal great power. It's the first returning great power. 200 years ago, China accounted for 33% of global production. It fell to a low of 3% by 1950. Today, it is 15%. Exactly the same share as US and Europe. And that's why you sense the tension. They're exactly equal. 10 years from now, China's share of global output will be 25, whereas the rest of the world's share of the US and Europe will be going down to about 12. So this tension is going to get worse. The last point I'd like to make in terms of how you deal with this tension, right now you see it manifested in terms of a trade war. The great irony is that this conflict has nothing to do with trade. America's been running a trade deficit every year for 40 straight years. And its deficit is only going to get larger, despite all these tariffs. China's trade surpluses peaked about 10 years ago. So it really is not running any trade surpluses. Its exchange rate is more or less in balance. Trade is not actually the issue. The real issue is technology. Technology transfer, innovation. So why has this become so important? Because for the first time, we have a mix between rising nationalism and technology. This is what I call technologically based nationalistic feeling emerging throughout the whole world. So what you need to look at, worry about, are the barriers in terms of flow of technology, the flow of information, the flow of students and scientists, the barriers between foreign investment, and as Mr. Kaplan indicated, you're likely to get a split between a so-called Western system and a Chinese system. This has major consequences for the world. It's going to lower investment, it's going to reduce growth, it's going to reduce productivity. It's a very serious consequence to the West. Now, if you ask the question, can it be resolved? As others have noted, very difficult. I don't think so, because you have two major powers, both believe strongly in their goals, of equal strengths. And we know that this kind of situation, the two groups cannot solve the problem. And for me, the solution must come from elsewhere. And the elsewhere, in my view, is Europe. Europe has to come and basically say, this kind of rivalry, this kind of split, is damaging everybody. No one is better off. And they basically have to force a broader discussion about a global compact. And it has to do a lot with this issue of technology, security, nationalism. Thank you.
Just one more word from you, because I think it's very interesting, your presentation about technological nationalism and your pledge for Europe to play a greater role. But the problem is that from our perspective, we Europeans, we consider ourselves as little small player in this technological battle. We feel very much that like we've already lost this competition for innovation and technology. We've not been able, and we probably are not going to be able in the next future to let emerge these giant players that you can see both in the US and China.
Let me make two observations. If you have the debate about 5G, the only alternative to a China-based 5G system lies in Europe. Okay, it doesn't lie in the United States. Okay. Artificial intelligence is being developed. These are the two sensitive areas, 5G and artificial intelligence. Both of these areas are what I call so sensitive that you need some kind of global understanding about how to share the benefits and regulations. And let me talk a little bit more about Europe. Europe's investments in China are twice as much as America's. Europe's exports that go through China, multiples more than America, okay? You go to China, you find many European companies manufacturing. You go to the malls, they're 70% European, okay? This crisis in terms of US-China trade tensions has a very major effect upon Europe. And that means that Europe has to figure out how to get involved. So Europe, economically, in terms of trade and foreign investment, is the same size as America and China. Now, you're absolutely correct, of course. Europe is not unified enough right now. It's diverted, its attention is diverting. This problem, however, will not be resolved today, tomorrow, the next year. It's going to require a look at the kinds of institutions and processes, including WTO, including something quite different. How do we deal with technology-related issues? Because the WTO is not equipped to deal with this issue. How do we deal with regulation of artificial intelligence and 5G networks? And I think this is the kind of discussion that Europe, United States, China, and the rest of Asia need to have a discussion on.
Okay, we're going to go to you, Mrs. Weiden, Anna Weiden, coming from the US too. You're international relations specialist at the University of Pennsylvania.
I would like to discuss one of the reasons for the current major shifts in international relations, which is the fact that the US under Trump no longer is willing to assume the role as hegemon. It is important to stress here that US administrations have negotiated their understanding of this role differently over time. Under President Obama, we could already see that the USA conferred less importance, for example, to the Middle East in favor of a pivot towards Southeast Asia. US retreat has created a security vacuum which other major powers are seeking to fill. It seems likely that international relations, at least for the foreseeable future, will be characterized by disorder while this reconfiguration of the geopolitical landscape takes place. Ultimately, I posit that we will see a new world order populated by regional hegemonic powers, but not a superpower. Major players here are Russia, Turkey, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Europe and India, albeit for different reasons. US hegemonic power as we know it originated in the 1940s post-World War order. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War in 1990 further cemented US hegemonic power. An essential source of hegemonic power is legitimacy, in the sense that hegemony can be perceived as a legitimate institution of international society in which special rights and responsibilities are conferred on the hegemon. Whereas US hegemonic legitimacy always have been contested, most recently by the outcome of the 2003 US military intervention in Iraq, the Trump administration no longer is willing to assume these responsibilities. Not only does the Trump administration refuse these responsibilities, it ignores international norms and regulations, embraces authoritarian regimes, and shuns multilateral institutions, as evidenced by the Trump administration's retreat from the Iran nuclear agreement and the Paris Climate Accords. The erosion of US legitimacy at the international stage means that it no longer is able to exert the same kind of influence over long-standing allies such as Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is currently undergoing considerable transformations at the domestic level, has, since Salman became king in January 2015, carried out an interventionist foreign policy, which in itself is a considerable shift from previous Saudi regimes. Some notable examples of this new, more aggressive Saudi foreign policy are the ongoing war in Yemen and the very controversial killing of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So this is kind of what I would like to lay out there. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to go back to Robert Kaplan, just before you leave, Robert. Maybe would like to hear from you about what looks like, if I understand correctly what has been said, it's kind of new deal that makes the fact that the United States are in a phase of a new isolationism, that they're in retreat from the rest of the world. The problem with Trump, his tweets, his backing from all international agreements makes China look like a more easiest partner for Europe. Do you think that there's a window of opportunity for Europe, and at what condition, according to you?
Yes, look, for 75 years, the United States was functionally speaking, in effect, an imperial power, a world empire. And people assumed that this was normal because our lives happened to coincide with these 75 years. So we assumed it as permanent. But in fact, it may be a very abnormal situation because the United States is a continental country, a vast continent with an internal economy separated by two vast oceans. So a very intensive form of constant internationalism does not come natural to it. On the other hand, the world has shrunk so much because of technology. The kind of pre-World War II isolationism in the US is simply not viable anymore. But to your point, when Chinese President Xi Jinping gave that speech in Davos in January 2017, offering China as the model for global cooperation, he could not have been able to make that speech had Donald Trump not just defeated Hillary Clinton in the November elections. It was because Trump gave him an opening. Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so America has no big idea to compete with China, with China's Belt and Road, with all of the problems and limitations of Belt and Road. So that, so can Europe fill the gap somewhat? I think the problem with that is that Europe itself is divided. Eastern Europe, the Poles, the Baltic states have a very different concept of the Russian threat than countries like France or Spain do. Then, the Chinese have been making deep inroads into the port system, the economies of Greece, Italy, and Portugal, whereas the Russians, have been adding a military emphasis on their side of the border facing Poland and the Baltic states. And, it was interesting that President Macron gave that interview to The Economist about 10 days ago, where he said that maybe it's not clear that all of NATO would come to the defense of one threatened member. And the Polish leadership just shot back, harshly attacking him, saying, who needs France if that's the way that a French president speaks? And by the way, France doesn't even contribute 2% of its GDP to its military, and it's conspiring with Germany to aid the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which helps Russia's influence in Western Europe. So I don't see the requisite unity in Europe for this to happen.
Thank you, Robert. You're free to leave whenever you want. Whenever you want. Okay, you're excused. And thank you for making me the easiest transition with the next topic, which I think is the crisis between NATO nations, the crisis also between EU nations. What we've seen is, not even to mention the Ukraine crisis, we've seen recently Donald Trump backing Turkey in their operation against the Kurds. We've seen Turkey, which is a member of NATO, buying Russian anti-missiles. We've seen President Macron in the same interview in The Economist saying that NATO was in a state of cerebral death. I'd like to have maybe the opinion of Mr. Ullman. You're chairman of Kiloway Group and senior advisor of the Atlantic Council.
I want to make 3 points. First, what are the greatest disruptors, threats that we face today? Second, one of the less visible dangers that you may not be thinking about but are possibly very real? And third, what, if anything, can we do about it? Clearly, the danger of climate change, global warming, global cooling is potentially existential, and we've not taken that seriously enough in the United States. But I would argue the greatest danger facing mankind today is failed and failing governments, which are almost ubiquitous. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, the list goes on. Even Israel cannot form a government. Brexit will break up Europe in a horrible way. And then, of course, the United States is in the throes of an impeachment process. So my point is that failed and failing government, rather than the decline of so-called liberal democracies, is probably the greatest danger that we face as a world society. Now, two dangers you may not be aware of. I take a different view about China. I think the most worrying thing about China is the threat of implosion. Going back centuries, the fear of emperors and general secretaries of the Communist Party was a peasant revolution, which occurred once a generation. The role of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is to provide for stability, no riots. In China, there are 300, 400, possibly 500 million Chinese who live at or under the poverty line. And so unless one gets real growth of 10%, 12%, there's a huge problem. And this is playing out in Hong Kong because President Xi is on the horns of a terrible dilemma. He cannot afford another Tiananmen Square, and yet the threat of Hong Kong spreading is very, very, very real. And so I think China is less solid than we believe today. China is also taking a huge bet on Belt and Road. Belt and Road really is an extension of the colonialist policies of the 17th and 18th centuries, and really the British during the 19th century. What China is saying is that it needs access to markets and to resources, because that's the only way it's going to fuel growth towards a consumer economy. It's spending trillions of dollars. But as it is finding in Sri Lanka, that when the Sri Lankans forego and have to give up a port, it's rather like taking over an empty building that you now own, but it doesn't provide much value. The second thing we ought to be aware of and worried about is the absence of Western leadership, largely sparked by America's refusal, or Trump's refusal, to play a traditional Republican role. There was no leadership globally from 1918 until 1939, and we ended up with the Second World War. At least after 1945, there was global leadership. But now in the post-Cold War period, there is no leadership, at least on the part of the West. Europe is incapable. Poor Macron is decrying the absence of anybody in Europe being able to do anything. And Donald Trump is withdrawing so quickly from so many treaties and agreements. Perhaps the next thing he will try to abrogate is the US Constitution. But this absence of leadership is very, very real. And that's why Putin and Xi are taking the lead and are really becoming far more important in terms of influence. Now the question is, what do we do about it? One of the other problems we face is that the mechanisms for global stability still came out of World War II, Bretton Woods, the United Nations, the IMF. And whereas we have augmented that with the World Trade Organization, the G7, the G9, the G66, we are still using 20th century tools in the 21st century. Now, I don't know how this is going to come out, but I would leave you with the words of wisdom of a combination of John Kennedy and William Shakespeare. John Kennedy famously said, somewhat cynically, that the only thing worse than being an enemy of the United States is being a friend or ally. And boy, is he correct. And Hamlet, to suffer the slings of outrageous fortune or to arm against a sea of troubles, gives us the dilemma that we face. Do we submit to outrageous fortune, or do we take on the sea of troubles? That is the dilemma globally we face, and quite frankly, the absence of leadership on the part of the West is, to me, the biggest danger right now that is confronting us.
Thank you, Mr. Ullman. It's quite a grim perspective. You didn't even mention NATO. Do you think
Sorry, what?
You didn't even mention NATO?
What's NATO?
Okay.
I'm sorry to say, there's no leadership in NATO, our strongest alliance. I think if Donald Trump gets a second term, he's very, very likely to withdraw from NATO substantially. In other words, do a Charles de Gaulle. NATO is the centerpiece of not only Western, but global stability. And the United States has dramatically, in my judgment, abandoned it. This notion of a 2% goal of GDP spending is fatuous and crazy. What you want is a smart defense. The Russians are not going to attack. They're not going to take over the Baltics. They did that after World War II, and they learned a great deal about that. And the fact that we in America are regarding China and Russia as enemies seems to me to be a huge problem, because they are not enemies unless we make them into that. And so I'm afraid that the value that NATO had, with 29 members now and a couple more to be added, so dilutes the strength of the alliance because of consensus, that I fear that NATO as a tool for stability is in great decline, and I'm not sure that's going to be reversed in the near future.
Thank you. We haven't talked yet about Russia, so we're going to do it maybe with you, Mr. Yaroslav Lisovlik, your program director of the Valdai Club and former chief economist at the Eurasian Development Bank. It seems that Russia was filling the void, at least in the Middle East, because we're going to maybe talk a little bit about the Middle East. At least in the Middle East, Russia is filling the void left by the United States. And it's not only since the election of Trump, it started before with Obama. We've seen, for example, his reluctance to intervene in Syria, for example, and the problem with the French president at the time, François Hollande. So, can you give us your perspective on the new role of Russia?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think with regard to the Middle East, I think, just as you said, I think the involvement to a significant degree was tactical, filling the void, whereas I think there are more strategic directions that are emerging in Russia's foreign policy, and the most important one is the turn to the east and the strategic partnership that is built with China. In the past several years, there's been an alliance along the trade lines with a non-preferential trade agreement concluded with China. There's a string of alliances that Russia is building with other countries in the region, in East Asia. Most recently, there was an FTA signed with Singapore. Previously, there was an FTA with Vietnam. So, despite this broader problem that we see of protectionism, Russia is making efforts to find ways to overcome the isolation that it faces in the West through greater engagement that it can obtain in the East and Asia. Another theme I wanted to bring up along the lines of what Mr. Ullman discussed with regard to global governance. I think clearly I would probably agree with the title of our section, the global disorder. At the national level, there's protectionism. At the global level, there's the problem with global institutions like the WTO. At the regional level, there's no integration of regional institutions into the global governance system. And this is at a time when regional integration blocks are playing an increasingly important role. My sense is that the bulk of the trade liberalization that we are seeing today is coming from regional integration. We're seeing major projects emerge like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 11 countries without the US that have built this alliance. There's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that China is forging with its partners in Asia, and then there's also the African continental free trade area. So we're talking about some very important developments in terms of regionalism. So how do we incorporate regionalism into global governance? I think we're seeing some very important trends in this regard. A proposal coming from China in 2017 called BRICS Plus that may be used as a platform to bring together the largest integration blocks, regional integration blocks along the South-South axis. And maybe there are other avenues to pursue this goal of integrating regionalism into global governance. One possibility would be to create a platform for regional development banks to finance large infrastructure projects. Another possibility would be to create the so-called Regional 20, a subset within the G20, where G20 countries are members, which would bring together the largest regional integration blocks throughout the entire world economy. So I think this is the big anomaly that we're seeing in the world economy today, the lack of integration of regionalism into global governance. And I think there are certain avenues that we can pursue to try to incorporate regionalism into global institutions, have horizontal coordination amongst regional blocks, but also greater vertical coordination between these regional blocks and global institutions such as the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF.
Thank you. Now Turkey, with Mr. Swetkinikioglu.
Okay, well, let me underline I'm not speaking on behalf of what Turkey does.
Of course.
But I think given the way the panel has developed, I think it's fair to say if you sit in Ankara these days, Turkey is formally part of the Western Alliance. It's technically an applicant, a candidate country to the European Union. It's a full member of NATO. But on the other hand, if you look at the world, especially the Western world, if you look at Trump, if you look at Brexit, if you look at the divisions within the European Union, when you sit in Turkey and look at the Western camp, you see a lot of division, weakness, and as I think one of the speakers before me said, no leadership. So, although Turkey is formally part of the Western Alliance, it's hedging itself. It also sees rising China, it sees a much more proactive Russia in the region and also globally. I mean, I have to admit, President Putin has raised Russia's profile in the region and globally, I would say, in a very short time, extremely effectively, given the resources and the capacity that Russia has. I mean, the Russian economy is 70% of Italy, but what they're doing globally on the geopolitical level, what they're doing in the Middle East and Syria, which matters a lot for Turkey, is phenomenal. I mean, President Obama thought in 2015, when the Russians were moving into Syria, let them go in and get bogged down, but they didn't get bogged down, actually. They actually managed quite a bit in Syria. So medium-sized countries like Turkey, especially Turkey is, I think, a good example because Turkey is neighbor to the Balkans, Europe, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and also to some extent to North Africa. I think countries like Turkey see an evolving and changing world and are afraid what comes next. And I think President Erdogan is someone who's extremely talented in hedging his bets and playing all sides at the same time, although sometimes in a very nasty level. Secondly, I would say I'm someone who was born and raised in Europe and live in Turkey, but I have to admit, and you know, I know the United States as well, the lack of recognition among Western elites to what the gentleman there said earlier about the lack of leadership is phenomenal. I mean, When you see what's happening right now in the United States with these impeachment hearings and the election next year, when you see what's happening with Brexit in the UK, when you see what's happening in Hungary, and how and now the recent interview by President Macron on NATO, etc., you truly have a total collapse of an order that I think Robert Kaplan rightly said may have been an anomaly. We tend to think as the post-World War II order as the normal or the norm, but maybe that was an anomaly in a longer time period. I mean, in our Turkish context, Turkey's westernization is around 80, 90 years old. But if you look at a longer term perspective, maybe Turkey's westernization was an anomaly in itself. From a long historic perspective, maybe that 90 years or 100 years of westernization that came through the Republic was an anomaly. So basically what I'm trying to say is, we live in a transition period where we do not know what will come next. And a lot of medium-sized powers like Turkey are hedging themselves and increase their links and their relations, their trade with China, with Russia, and others. Because there is no longer leadership, there is no longer a guarantee. Most Turks don't believe that Belgian soldiers will come to the aid if Turkey is attacked by someone. And we've seen that in 1991, during the Gulf War, when German and some other NATO members were reluctant to come when the Gulf War happened. There was a threat by Saddam Hussein that they might attack Turkey. There is a gray area. I think there's been a lot of criticism about President Macron's statement, but there's also an element of truth. I mean, we all know, that perhaps Belgian soldiers or, I don't know, other NATO members may not be there when Lithuania is attacked, or when Estonia is being attacked, or if Turkey is attacked. So Article 5 is no longer as solid as it used to be. And I think, although I'm not in agreement at all with my president's politics, but I think when you look at it from a sort of macro perspective, we are in a world of a lot of uncertainties. And it is only natural that medium-sized powers like Turkey tries to decrease their risks by engagement with Russia, China, and others, although these are authoritarian states. I think one of the reasons we have this crisis right now is really the crisis of democracy. We have kleptocrats, we have authoritarians who have figured out the game of democracy and how to corrupt it. And there's not much you can do about it because, including in the United States and the UK, which has the oldest constitution on this planet. So, basically, this is a much larger discussion about capitalism, democracy, etc. But let me conclude with the following. We should actively think of new models. And I think the Russians are doing that in some extent. I'm not familiar a lot with what the Chinese are proposing, but I think we need to rethink a post-Western order, and I think Westerners themselves would have an interest in discussing that. They are reluctant to do that, and I understand that what is why. But I think it's inevitable what we see right now, especially if Mr. Trump is re-elected next year. There's going to be a lot of chaos, and I think it's time for people to think of what this transition may look like in a way that is least damaging to all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to go from Turkey to the Gulf, and it's going to be with Her Excellency Samira Rajab, you're a special envoy of the Kingdom of Bahrain. We have a very bloody war in Yemen. We have very preoccupying events like tankers being attacked by Iran, Saudian tankers. We have it's really under a volcano, and I would like to hear from you, for a small country in the Gulf, also a good, well-advised actor. how do you consider the evolution of your region? And you can extend to the rest of the Middle East, of course, if you want so. Mr. Rajab, I give you the floor. And you're going to speak in Arabic, so if there's some of you that don't understand Arabic, I advise you to take the translation, like I will do. Mr. Rajab, you have?
Thank you, Mr. Atta. منطقة الخليج العربي أنا عندي ملاحظة فقط في المقدمة التي كتبت عن هذه الندوة ذكر الخليج الفارسي. حقيقة هذا المسمى غير عادل وغير صحيح تاريخيا وإلى هذا اليوم هو الخليج العربي، فقط لأثبت هذا الموضوع.
It's written the Gulf.
Yeah, it's Arabian Gulf.
Okay.
Not Persian. منطقة الخليج منطقة غنية، معروف هذه قضايا لا نحتاج أن نتكلم فيها، غنية جدا، منطقة جيوسياسية واستراتيجية مهمة جدا، كانت كذلك في الحرب الباردة، وكان للولايات المتحدة والغرب دور في فرض الهيمنة على هذه المنطقة من أجل ثرواتها، من أجل أهميتها وحيويتها الجيوسياسية. واليوم تدور المعارك حول نفس الأهداف. منطقة الخليج والمنطقة العربية اليوم تعيش حالة من الاضطراب الفريدة من نوعها، أو لم تعشها خلال قرن أو القرون الماضية. بدأت منذ سقوط الاتحاد السوفيتي أو ربما مع انتهاء الحرب الباردة، واليوم واضح أن كل هذه الاضطرابات في منطقة الخليج والمنطقة العربية هو ضمن الصراع على إنشاء نظام دولي جديد. خلال العقد الأول من القرن العشرين كان صراعاً خطيراً، بدأ بتفجير البرجين في نيويورك وإعلان حرب على الإرهاب لتبدأ كل أنواع الحروب في منطقة الخليج والمنطقة العربية، من التدخل العسكري في العراق إلى حرب الإرهاب وصناعة الإرهاب ونشر الإرهاب في المنطقة، الحروب بالوكالة في المنطقة بأسرها، حروب لا متماثلة، كلها حروب ظهرت، مصطلحات ظهرت في الأدبيات الأمريكية. فهذه الحالة التي تعيشها المنطقة إلى هذا اليوم طبعاً انتقلت ما بعد 2011 إلى حالة جديدة من الصراعات، لأن في تصورنا وفي اعتقادنا الكامل أن مع دخول روسيا إلى سوريا وفرض دور جديد دولي لروسيا في العالم تغيرت المعادلة، انتهى حلم القطب الواحد في نظام دولي جديد لقطب واحد، انتقل إلى صراع آخر لتشكيل لربما نوع جديد من النظام الدولي، ربما متعدد الأقطاب أو ذو قطبين. صار هذا الصراع الصيني أو الأمريكي الصيني دليل كبير على هذا الموضوع. ولكن المنطقة العربية برمتها اليوم تدفع ثمن كل هذه الصراعات، وهي صراعات غير عادلة أدت إلى أن تبحث المنطقة عن حلفاء استراتيجيين. اليوم دول الشرق العظمى الصين وروسيا، سواء أيضا الدول النفطية الكبرى في جنوب آسيا، الدول الجمهوريات الآسيوية السوفيتية القديمة هي تفرض نفسها، الهند أيضا، هي كلها دول كبرى تصنع لها دور في المنطقة ودور سلمي وليس دور إرهابي أو عسكري كما عودتنا عليها المنظومة الغربية بشكل عام على مدار قرن. اليوم الخليج كما كان ولا زال لدينا علاقات قوية واستراتيجية مع أوروبا ومع الولايات المتحدة، أيضا اتجهت إلى الصين كدولة عظمى وإلى روسيا لفتح علاقات جديدة استراتيجية بمنهجية عالية، على أساس وعلى رغبة شديدة نشوء نظام دولي متعدد الأقطاب يكون أكثر أمناً وسلاما من الوضع الحالي الذي نعيشه. أعتقد استفراد دولة واحدة لقيادة العالم بقيادة الولايات المتحدة أعتقد أثبت عدم عدالته وعدم حرصه على استتباب الأمن وفرض قضايا ترفضها الشعوب، ترفضها الأنظمة، فرض الفوضى، فرض الحروب على مناطق النفوذ، بحيث تكتسب الولايات المتحدة الدور الأقوى في هذه المناطق. فهناك استجابة عكسية في هذه المناطق للدور الأمريكي وانفتاح كبير على دول العالم التي تبحث أكثر عن البناء وليس عن الهدم والتدمير. شكرا.
Thank you, Mrs. Rajab. And eventually we're going to go to you, Mr. Miro Kovac. You're the only speaker coming from a European country. And you're president of the External Committee of the Croatian Parliament. Okay, you're going to speak as the last speaker. Maybe it's because from what we've been hearing, we see that there's a tremendous crisis in democracies. Democracy is a pillar of the European Union. We've seen a lot of problem, as Mr. Ullman said, a lot of problem of leadership in democracies. Could see what's happening in Belgium, in Spain, in Italy, in United Kingdom. And we've seen countries like Russia, Turkey, or China, countries, if they're not dictatorship, they are very authoritarian democracies or regime, taking the lead or emptying the void. And we've seen that, what's the room for Europe? What can Europe do to transmit these values of human rights, of democracy, of independence? Are you going to be optimistic, or are you going to reinforce the green perspective that I've been hearing this morning on this panel?
Thank you so much. So when you look at the title of the panel, China, Europe, Gulf, Turkey, Russia, and the US, the only power not being today revisionist is Europe. The EU is the only power not seeking to change the world order. China, Turkey, Russia, and the US want to change the world order. The same applies to India. So the post-World War order is collapsing, and I'm personally happy about Mr. Macron's interview he gave to The Economist, because independently from his standpoint, this is also the way I personally reason. So we have to change something about leadership in Europe. The US contributed significantly to creating the European community in the 50s. The idea was to have a partner to fight against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Russia was in a very bad shape. In the meantime, Russia has become, politically speaking, a revisionist force, playing a role it had in the 19th century, some kind of le gendarme de l'Europe. The new Russian policy is to have its own sphere of interest and to protect it. That's why Russia intervened in Ukraine and in Georgia, to show clearly to the world it would not accept to be attacked politically, militarily by the Western-led coalition, basically by the US. We have China, which is rising, and so the only solution is, coming back to Mr. Yukon, that we in the European Union start thinking strategically. In 2050, when the migration crisis broke out, what did we do? We accepted the migrants, the refugees from Syria basically, but we did not think strategically. We should have at that time thought about sending forces for humanitarian issues in Syria, or making ourselves available. We didn't do anything. The German Minister of Defense, she made a good proposal, it was not accepted. It is too late in 2019. So, first of all, what the European Union has to achieve, it has to understand that the European Union has to be the main power on the European continent. What we are having right now between the US and Europe is a struggle about the distribution of resources in the political West. The two major powers in the political West are the US and the European Union. The US being, of course, the most important power in the world too. But we have to sit together and talk to each other. What do we want? Do we want to pull out completely from the European Union? From Europe? Tell us. I think that we have to stick together. We have to stick together in the political West, the European Union and the US, but at the same time, we have to agree upon who does what. We should be the main power on the European continent and thinking about how to do it together with the US, with China, with Turkey on a world level. This is the only approach we can choose if we want in the long run to be the masters on the European continent, and if we want to have a model which is tenable for the European continent and also for the world. I think that when it comes to China, China has strong commercial relations with the European Union. The first trade partner of Germany is not France anymore. It's not the Netherlands anymore, not the US. The first trade partner of Germany is China. That is reality. So we need some kind of new Congress, World Congress, and to have some kind of agreement who does what in the world. What Mr. Trump, this is my last important thesis. What Mr. Trump does is nothing original. He is just continuing the policy of Mr. Obama. Look at Syria. Look at the policy when it comes to energy security. You look at Mr. Chaîne and his policy. You look at Mr. Obama. You look at Mr. Trump. So the US wants to become autonomous when it comes to energy matters. So Mr. Obama has continued the policy of Mr. Bush, and Mr. Trump is continuing the policy of Mr. Obama. But we, in the European Union, have to stick together with our American friends and make a deal about who does what in the political West. Thank you.
I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Ullman, but just one question for you, Mr. Kovac, before. Can you be a little bit more specific about Syria and the Kurds? Do you think that, for example, Europe should have and can still build a military coalition, just like President Chirac did with Bosnia, seeing, for example, that the UN was doing nothing to stop the massacre. He launched a European coalition, he promoted it, he led the coalition, he brought the German with us, with the French soldiers, and they went to Bosnia, and there's been an intervention without permission from NATO. Do you think that we should have done that to rescue the Kurds that have been our allies in the war against terrorism? And we can mention that Trump has been very cynical. He said, I don't care if there's, for example, terrorists from the Islamic State escaping, because they're going to escape in Europe. They're not going to escape in the United States. Okay, so it was our business, we Europeans, our business.
When it comes to the European Union, it showed, unfortunately, that it was not capable of solving the war in the former Yugoslavia. So the Brits and the French were in, there was a rapid reaction force, but we were in the end dependent upon the intervention of the US. Without the US, there would not have been a peace solution for Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yeah, Dayton.
Yes.
But before that,
yes,
the intervention was Europe.
Yes, but we should have learned something from that. So when it comes to Syria, let's be very honest. Europe's external security, sécurité extérieure, the French would say, is at stake in Syria. So what should Europe have done? It should have done something on the ground in Syria, to do something for the refugees in Syria. It didn't do anything. And then the US also pulled out, and today, what do we have today? Today we have Russia and Turkey being the crisis managers with, and accepted by the US. So the crisis managers in Syria are today Russia and Turkey. And Europe is in a certain way the hostage of the goodwill of Russia and Turkey. So this can be a solution, of course. We can say this is exactly what we want. But at the same time, we could also say, but we also want to be present there in Syria because it's our security. It is about security of the European Union, because many refugees went from Syria to Turkey and then to Europe. And what happened in Europe? Look at Germany. The landscape of the German political scene has changed because of the migration crisis. You have now a party, 15% in Germany, AfD, which is changing completely the political landscape. The CDU, SPD have become much weaker because of AfD. So this is also the result of the migration crisis. So that's why I'm saying we have to think about our external security and send forces to regions where there are crises, to regions which can affect Europe's security.
Yes, and there's only France, because France being now the main military power in Europe, because Britain has one foot outside, France is the only country that can take the leadership in this kind of intervention. And maybe there's not enough understanding or agreement on letting France doing their job inside the European Union. Mr. Ullman, one last point before we take a few questions from the audience.
I referenced Kennedy and Shakespeare. I want to talk about Oswald Spengler and Vladimir Lenin. Spengler, as you know, wrote about the decline of nations, Greece, Rome, the Ottoman Empire, China, the Qing Emperor. The fundamental issues that we face when Lenin said there are contradictions. In the United States, the Constitution is based on checks and balances, which requires civility and compromise and two functioning political parties. Donald Trump has destroyed the Republican Party, a party of fiscal conservatism and international engagement. And the Democratic Party has been pushed to the far, far, far left, but it's no longer credible. Interestingly, the same thing has happened in Britain. That Labour Party is incredible under Corbyn, would nationalize everything. The Tories are divided three ways among the hard leavers, the rational leavers, and the remainers. And the European Union is under great pressure by the fundamental contradiction and has never been able to resolve trying to turn a monetary union into a political union. I would argue that the way out of this dilemma is that the United States and Britain have to solve their political issues at home. Because if they can't, if we can't, I don't see any leadership naturally emerging. Macron, in my judgment, was right, but France is not going to be able to gain leadership, and therefore Vladimir Putin and President Xi are on a roll because they have strategies, they are clever, they are opportunistic, and quite frankly, they've been playing very, very weak hands rather well.
And they have leadership. Thank you. Alors nous allons pouvoir prendre des questions. Et, mon cher ami de l'Institut marocain des relations internationales, évidemment.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vois dans le titre qu'il y a presque tous les continents et il n'y a pas l'Afrique. Or, nous sommes à Tanger, en Afrique. Alors, ma question à tous les panélistes, c'est quel serait, d'après vous, le positionnement de l'Afrique dans le nouvel ordre mondial, si jamais il y a un nouvel ordre mondial? Et ma deuxième question, Madame Raja, je suis vraiment peiné parce que le Conseil de coopération du Golfe était quand même une force et jouait un rôle très important. Or, malheureusement, il y a eu ce différend entre l'Arabie saoudite et quelques autres contre Qatar. Comment l'expliquez-vous et comment trouver une solution pour que le Conseil de coopération du Golfe puisse jouer à nouveau son rôle? Merci.
Merci. Des réponses courtes, s'il vous plaît, parce que nous devons terminer dans 5 minutes. Alors, la première question était adressée à qui? Ah oui, à tous, mais oui, mais on ne va pas pouvoir tous répondre. Who wants to answer the first question on the place of Africa? It's right that we don't have anyone from an African country today. Monsieur.
Maybe very briefly,
Yeah.
I did mention Africa, in fact, in the context of the free trade area that is being created. And I think for me, the vision here is that Africa has led the way in many respects in terms of regionalism in the developing world, and I think going forward, Africa could play an active role in forming those platforms that I talked about, South-South platforms of economic integration. I think this is the future of regionalism, whereby mega blocks are going to cooperate increasingly with each other. And I think it's very important that we see actually Africa's leadership in this process.
Thank you. Mrs. Rajab, you want to answer on the second question?
نعم سيدي، هناك خلاف في مجلس التعاون الخليجي، ولكن لاحظ أن رغم هذا الخلاف قطر لم تنسحب من هذا المجلس، ولا زالت قطر عضو في مجلس التعاون الخليجي، وهناك تعاونات مختلفة بين قطر وبين كل دول مجلس التعاون. هذا رقم واحد. رقم اثنين، الخلاف السياسي هذا موجود في معظم دول العالم. لو ترك العرب بشأنهم حلت هذه المشاكل. كانت هناك خلافات سابقة في المنطقة العربية، خلافات عربية لأسباب تدخلات مباشرة وغير مباشرة. هذه الخلافات تحولت إلى حروب وإلى اقتتال. اليوم الخليج وعوا إلى ما يحدث حولهم، ومن المؤكد أن سيجدون حل لهذا الخلاف، ولكن أعيد وأكرر المنطقة العربية برمتها وليس فقط منطقة الخليج. إن تركت المنطقة لشأنها لحل مشاكلها وللتطوير وللتنمية لعملت الكثير، ولكن التدخلات المستمرة منذ قرن وإلى اليوم وإلى غدا، الأطماع الدولية والأقطاب الدولية والصراع الدولي، كل هذا ينصب في هذه المنطقة، ولذلك نجد الكثير من الخلافات والصراعات التي بحاجة إلى حلول مباشرة داخليا بدون أي تدخلات، حتى أزمة اليمن من ضمن هذه.
Merci. Je suis vraiment navré, mais il faut qu'on libère la salle et laisser la place au panel suivant. conçois très bien que ce soit un peu frustrant, que vous aviez beaucoup de questions. Vous pouvez peut-être éventuellement poursuivre la conversation avec nos panélistes après. Je vous remercie beaucoup. Restez ici, restez pas très loin parce que la journée ne fait que commencer. Merci beaucoup de votre attention et d'avoir assisté. Et merci à tous les participants de ce très intéressant panel ce matin. Bonne journée.